Some of the fat on the human body does not behave the way most people assume. It is not the soft layer you can grip between your fingers. It is not the fat that shrinks first when you eat a little less or move a little more for a couple of weeks. The fat I want to talk about today lives much deeper, pressed into the abdominal cavity and wrapped around the organs that keep you alive: the liver, the pancreas, the intestines. Researchers call it visceral fat. And the more closely scientists study it, the clearer it becomes that this tissue acts less like a quiet storage depot and more like a living, signaling organ in its own right. What makes visceral fat worth understanding is not only where it sits, but how it talks to the rest of the body. Unlike the subcutaneous fat under your skin, visceral fat is crowded with hormone receptors. These receptors are constantly listening for chemical instructions, and two of the loudest messages they respond to come from insulin and cortisol. So visceral fat is not simply sitting there waiting for you to burn it off. It is waiting for your hormones to tell it whether the moment calls for storing energy or releasing it. This is exactly where most people misread the problem. The popular belief is that fat disappears when you push harder, train longer, cut calories more aggressively, and the body should hand over its reserves. But visceral fat does not act like a passive fuel tank. It behaves more like a guarded emergency supply. And there is a good evolutionary reason for that. For most of human history, survival depended on keeping fast access energy close to the vital organs. If food vanished or danger appeared, that deep fat could rapidly fuel the systems that kept a person alive. Because it served such a protective role, the body still defends visceral fat far more stubbornly than the fat sitting nearer the surface. And the entire defense is run by signals, not by willpower. When stress hormones climb, visceral fat cells receive a simple instruction: hold on. When insulin rises after a meal, the instruction grows stronger: store this and lock it down. Those messages once kept our ancestors alive through unpredictable seasons. The trouble is that modern mornings, packed with rushing, stress, and instant food, can trip those same ancient signals almost every single day. Many people imagine that fat gets quietly burned overnight while they sleep, since the body has technically been fasting for hours by sunrise. But the more important metabolic decision tends to happen later, often within the first hour after you open your eyes. This short early window quietly sets the tone for how your metabolism behaves across the rest of the day. Two people can eat nearly identical meals, follow similar routines, and train the same amount, yet end up with very different results, partly because their mornings sent their bodies very different biological messages. Picture the body as constantly asking one question: is this environment stable enough to spend energy freely, or unpredictable enough that energy should be hoarded? Your hormones answer that question long before your conscious mind starts planning the day. When you wake, your body shifts into a state built for action. Cortisol begins to rise, sharpening alertness and helping mobilize fuel. At the same time, the liver releases glucose into the bloodstream so your brain and muscles have something to run on. If you have not eaten, insulin stays relatively low. That combination creates a brief opening where energy is circulating but has not yet been pushed into storage. In that moment, the body is essentially deciding what kind of day it thinks it is walking into. If the morning starts with stress, a frantic schedule, heavy stimulation, or food that spikes insulin fast, the message is unmistakable: store the energy. Visceral fat tightens its grip. But if the morning unfolds differently, with calm movement, natural light, and a gradual ramp up rather than a jolt, the chemistry shifts. Insulin stays low. Circulating glucose gets pulled into working muscle, and visceral fat is no longer chemically locked away. This is where one almost absurdly simple behavior becomes powerful. Gentle movement early in the morning. A light walk shortly after waking looks like nothing on paper. It burns very few calories. It does not feel like a real workout, but metabolically it intersects with the body at a precise and influential moment. When muscles contract during walking, they activate a glucose uptake route that does not lean heavily on insulin. The key player here is a transporter called GLUT4. Muscle contraction prompts these GLUT4 transporters to move to the surface of the muscle cell, where they act like doorways that let glucose flow directly out of the blood and into the muscle to be used as fuel. The result is quiet but meaningful. Instead of glucose pooling in the bloodstream and forcing a spike in insulin, that circulating energy is calmly absorbed and spent. Insulin stays low. And as long as insulin stays low, visceral fat is no longer chemically sealed off, which means the body can begin tapping into stored fat as a secondary fuel source. If this is already reshaping how you think about morning fat loss, it is worth following along, because the next layer is where the timing really matters. This does not produce a dramatic burst of fat burning, despite what flashier fitness messaging likes to promise. What it actually does is nudge the direction of metabolism. Over the following hours, the body grows more comfortable switching between glucose and fat for fuel. Scientists call this capacity metabolic flexibility, and it is one of the better markers of a healthy, adaptable metabolism. As flexibility improves, the body depends less on a constant drip of carbohydrate and becomes more willing to draw on stored energy when needed. Visceral fat, being especially sensitive to insulin, tends to be among the first reserves to loosen. So the walk itself is not the magic. The magic is when it happens. Early movement meets the body at the exact time it is already deciding how energy will flow for the day. Align the signals, and the body does not have to be forced into using fat. The conditions simply allow it. Get the timing wrong, and even hard effort can backfire. To see why this window is so important, look closer at what is happening in those first hours. Your metabolism is already in motion before you are fully awake. The liver is feeding glucose into the blood to power your brain, and that is entirely normal and healthy. But what happens to that glucose next can tilt your metabolism in one direction or the other. If it lingers in the bloodstream while you stay still, the pancreas eventually releases insulin to clear it. And here is the part most people miss. While insulin is elevated, access to stored fat is temporarily shut down. Insulin is, above all, a storage signal. As long as it is high, the body reads the environment as one of abundance, and conserves rather than releases. Fat oxidation slows, and visceral fat becomes chemically out of reach. That is why a sedentary morning can quietly steer metabolism toward fat preservation, without anyone noticing. The glucose is there, but if no active tissue uses it, insulin rises to manage it, the window closes, and the body slips into storage mode, even on a fairly light breakfast. Muscle movement offers a way around this by pulling glucose in without demanding much insulin at all. The liver responds to this too. When it senses that muscles are actively using glucose, it eases off on producing extra glucose later in the day, which helps keep blood sugar steadier through the afternoon and evening. Steadier blood sugar means calmer insulin, and calmer insulin keeps fat accessible instead of repeatedly locking it away. There is also a knock-on effect worth mentioning. Visceral fat drains directly into the liver through the portal vein, so the state of this deep fat and the health of the liver are tightly linked. Keeping insulin calm and fat metabolism active supports both at once. Cortisol falls into a healthier pattern as well. It is often cast purely as a stress hormone, but it actually follows a natural daily rhythm, including a predictable morning rise, sometimes called the cortisol awakening response. Gentle morning activity lets cortisol follow that natural curve, rising enough to support focus and energy, then tapering off as the day goes on. But when the morning opens with intense stress, an aggressive fasted workout, or piles of stimulation, cortisol can spike hard and stay elevated longer than intended. A prolonged spike reads biologically as an unpredictable environment, and the body responds by guarding its reserves more carefully, visceral fat included. This explains a paradox that trips a lot of people up. High-intensity training is genuinely excellent for the heart and for building muscle, but performed immediately on waking, fasted, and under mental stress, it can create a hormonal backdrop that pushes the body toward conserving energy afterward. Low-stress movement, like an easy walk, sends the opposite message. It is safe to transition from rest into activity. Energy flows smoothly, hormones stay stable, and the system keeps its flexibility. The difference looks small day to day, but repeated over weeks and months. Small hormonal shifts compound into large metabolic ones. So what does the routine actually look like? It rests on 3 quiet pillars. The first is light. Within the first few minutes of waking, exposure to natural daylight helps synchronize the brain's master clock. housed in a region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which coordinates hormone timing across the entire body. Morning light tells that clock the day has begun, so cortisol follows its natural curve and your metabolic rhythms line up with daytime activity, which in turn supports steadier appetite and better insulin sensitivity later on. The second pillar is gentle movement. Rather than staying still, the body benefits from calm activity that coaxes muscles into using circulating glucose. And the simplest effective version is just walking. 10 to 20 relaxed minutes lets muscles contract rhythmically without triggering a stress response. GLOT, 4 transporters do their work, insulin stays low, and stored fat stays reachable. The third pillar is a little patience with food. Many people wake and eat immediately, often something that spikes insulin fast, which slams the window shut almost as soon as it opened. Leaving a modest gap between waking, moving, and eating helps preserve that low insulin, fat-friendly state. This is not about skipping meals or forcing harsh fasting. It is simply about letting the body transition out of sleep before flooding it with incoming energy. There are also a few easy ways to undo all of this. The most common is turning the walk into a workout, assuming faster must mean better and pushing the pace until you are breathing hard. The moment the body reads the activity as stressful, cortisol climbs and the message flips toward conservation. The second is stacking stimulation, like large doses of caffeine the instant you wake, especially alongside exertion, which amplifies the morning cortisol rise into unnecessary hormonal pressure. Moderate caffeine a bit later is usually fine. The third is overextending. Very long walks, full skipped meals, and prolonged fasting layered on top can push blood sugar too low, drive cortisol up to compensate, and cause insulin to rebound. The body ends up with mixed signals again. The whole point is simplicity because the routine works by matching your physiology, not overwhelming it. What kind of mornings have you been giving your body without realizing it? It is genuinely worth thinking about and worth sharing below if this changed how you see it. Over time, the effects stack up. Morning glucose gets handled more efficiently, insulin responses calm down, energy steadies, appetite settles, and the body grows more willing to burn stored fat between meals. Visceral fat does not vanish overnight, but when the hormonal environment keeps signaling safety and stable energy use, that deep fat slowly loses its reason to stay locked down and the body begins letting it go. So instead of asking how many calories you torched this morning, ask a better question. What message did your body actually receive? Urgency, stress and stimulation, or calm activation and controlled energy use? Those two openings look almost identical from the outside, yet they send metabolism in opposite directions. If you want to test it on yourself, try this for the next 7 days. Start your morning with a few minutes of natural light and 10 to 15 minutes of relaxed walking before breakfast. Do not overhaul your diet, do not pile on extreme workouts. Just watch how your energy, hunger, and focus shift through the day. Because visceral fat is not beaten into submission by force. It is released when the body stops believing it needs to protect itself, and that shift can begin with the smallest decision made early in the morning.